Hey guys, welcome back to Warrior Radio. I'm Tony Baldwin, and in today's episode, I have Sky Nelson with me today. And he is a physicist who studies the science behind a well-known but really little understood phenomena called synchronicity. And if you're like most people, you've experienced this phenomenon sometime in your life. Maybe you were thinking of a friend, and then out of the blue, you get a phone call from them. Or maybe you and a friend were talking about a certain topic, and the next day you stumble upon that book on that same topic while you were, say, browsing the bookstore. So we talk about these things in this interview, but all this really reminded me, and we talk about this in this interview, this quote from Joseph Campbell, the anthropologist, and he said that when you follow your bliss, the universal open doors where there are only walls. And this is very much tied to synchronicity. And I could fully attest to this in my own life. So a few years ago, I was living in cold Madison, Wisconsin. And I was just kind of cruising in my life. Things were okay, but they were definitely not where I wanted them to be. So personally at the time, I really wanted to work on, this warrior project full time. I wanted to do things like travel, and I really didn't want to be stuck in an office job, doing things I didn't, love and enjoy. So, with that intention of where I wanted to go, I took a leap of faith to the jungle of Peru, and I went on an ayahuasca retreat, wanting something different. And once I made that leap of faith, and once I jumped, a series of events really happened from that point that was very much a reflection of that Joseph Campbell quote. There was a lot of synchronistic events that occurred, within that next year. I met key people, I stumbled upon certain books, certain opportunities came my way, and all these things all helped me get closer towards that intention that I set out for myself. So, right now as I'm recording this, I'm in Bali, Indonesia, where I live and I work full-time on the site warrior.do. I spent the last couple of years traveling around Asia, going to places like Japan or Thailand or Sri Lanka. And, I'm not saying any of this to brag, and things are far from perfect in my life, but, I can say that, personally, synchronicity is something that has really shown in my life. And, so that's really why I'm excited to speak with someone like Sky Nelson, who's a physicist, and he's actually been studying this phenomenon under the lens of science, under the lens of math, and with objectivity. So today I pick his brain, and it's really, really fascinating. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and if you do, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, give us a rating, and really let us know what you think, because it really helps grow this project. And, topics like this, like synchronicity, get spread to a wider public. So with all that said, let's get into today's episode with Sky Nelson. Enjoy. So for those that don't know, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name is Sky Nelson, and I am a physicist and musician and software engineer. I've also been involved with spiritual practice for many, many years. Well, since I was a kid, I grew up with my parents were following Swami Satchidananda, and Satchidananda is the community I grew up in, and learned a lot about spiritual practices and traditions from that. And then I ended up doing physics in college and continued on that path. I was a high school teacher for many years, teaching physics and math, as well as I've been a full-time musician for part of my life. I've worked as a software engineer and project coordinator for a while. And currently, I am developing the material that I've done I'm in graduate school doing physics and doing my own research as well. I do research on string theory and as well as research on synchronicity. And in my research on synchronicity has real applications to, I think, the way we live our lives and the decisions we make. And so I've developed that material as it applies to organizations and organizational development, mostly because organizations are where we're doing the real work of change in the world. Whether it's your schools or your businesses or your governments or all of these organizations are doing the work of change. Organizations are where we interact with each other and make a difference. So I've developed material to help folks in the world of their business world and their work life may take advantage of the unexpected opportunities that come their way.
Awesome. And I definitely want to get into sort of all the meat with synchronicity that you've researched and studied over the last few years. But before we get into that, how did you get into this field? Like, how did you get on this path? And because there's not many people that sort of merge science with things like spirituality and whatnot. So how did you sort of get on this path?
I think that ultimately most physicists are on the path they're on because they have an insatiable thirst to understand the world around them. For me, that meant understanding not only the world outside of myself, but also my own experience and the world inside of myself. I was raised, my parents were devotees of Sri Swami Satchidananda, so I was surrounded by a pretty well-developed spiritual tradition from very early on, and I sought out other traditions as well, including Taoism and Buddhism and Sufism and mystical Christianity and all sorts of, I find inspiration in all these places because as I learned from my upbringing, truth is one, paths are many. So from any of these traditions and from any of the people in our lives, we can learn important things. And in that search for truth, if you're really looking for truth, you're willing to look for it wherever you find it. And that's where I found, the merging of the truth that I found in physics and science with the truth that I found from introspection and meditative practice.
Wow.
I felt that those had to come together.
Yeah. Like, how
Otherwise,
was it?
I wasn't living my truth.
Yeah. So how was it as a child sort of being around Swami Satchidananda and sort of training with him? Because not many kids at that age are around, that type of person, that figure.
It was great. I wouldn't use that word training, and that's the great thing about it. I was just raised. My parents were trained by him, and I was raised around him and around them. So I took it for granted. I took what they were doing for granted. I took the fact that they were meditating and doing yoga for granted. I took the fact that they had an ashram that was beautiful, that they had built, where people were spending time in silence and spending time communicating deeply. All of these things were just obvious to me from that upbringing. And the idea of truth is one, paths are many and that's Satchidananda's motto. That was ingrained in me from early on. So ultimately, that's been the guiding force of my life, not just with respect to religions, which is how it was intended, but with respect to people, that we are all on a path. And if I'm in a meeting with 5 other people, each of us has a truth that is respectable and important to understand. And that's a key factor in my view of things and how synchronicity works too. Seeing messages and usefulness and truth from all different sources.
Well, synchronicity, it's one of those things where we all kind of have had those experiences, but there's not much literature out there that sort of that break it down. There's not many researchers out there. So when did you start thinking that you want to dive into this field with research and physics and whatnot?
It's a good question. It all unfolded in a very somewhat, what should I say, maybe intentional way, but not my intention. I noticed, from early on in college, I was really interested in some of the mathematics around Fourier analysis and signal processing and how you can break up literally any shape or signal into building blocks. Basically, it's like you can deconstruct any information into like little Legos that you put together, and there happen to be waves, little waves that you put together. Any combination of these waves, and you can create any shape you want. And so that was fascinating to me early on. And then I got really into quantum mechanics after I graduated from college because I didn't really like it in college. But then I began reading books like the Dancing Woolley Masters and a book called The Strange Story of the Quantum by Benesh Hoffman. And these were books that didn't go into the mathematics. They talked about the implications, the philosophical implications and what we call ontological implications, which really just is another way of saying what is really there in the world. Like we can describe it with equations, but what is it? What is matter? What is energy? Are they things? Are they ephemeral? Are they something we can actually touch, or is that an illusion? So all of those questions became much more interesting to me from the books I was reading. And then I began to have experiences that I'd had them for a long time, but as starting to really pay attention to the patterns of showing up to a movie and having to have my best friend happen to be there at the same time. And I was alone that day and I was so bummed, but here my best friend shows up to the same movie. And well, how did that happen? I mean, most of us, I think, take those moments of synchronicity and alignment between circumstances and we say, wow, that's amazing. And then we kind of shrug it off and move on. But for me, I didn't shrug it off. I wanted to understand it. And I didn't quickly jump onto the idea that I'm going to study synchronicity as a physicist. I sort of tried to keep those separate because I wanted my physics work to be, I guess, sort of mainstream. But ultimately, if you're going to do something interesting, it's often outside the mainstream. So I realized that's where I was heading and started really doing the work.
Wow. And when you sort of brought this up in sort of the academic settings, what were some of the reactions and some of the feedback that you were getting from your peers?
Well, it's pretty interesting. It depends on who you talk to, you know. On one hand, I have like all the students I work with, not all, a lot of the students that are my graduate student friends, because I'm a graduate student right now at San Francisco State. They are generally very interested. They're younger and they tend to be fairly open-minded and they don't know what is so yet. And so they're open-minded and they've had these experiences. So they're generally all really interested in somebody who has something really rigorous to say. Like, okay, you can talk about synchronicity, but show me the math. Show me how it really works. And then I'll start listening. So that's what I've developed is, you know, being able to have those conversations and stand up to it. And then you got people like my advisor who I don't really talk about this with because it's obvious from what he said in our classes and stuff, just generally, not to me directly, but that he's not interested in anything that has to do with the psyche or being psychic. And I don't focus on those words, but I think it's related to the idea of synchronicity. So he's a fairly mainstream thinker, and I do my research with him. I'm researching string theory with him, but we talk about string theory most of the time and stay focused on that part of my research. So it depends on who you talk to. You just got to pick your audience well. It's just like when I go and talk to people who are working in a business, I speak their language as much as I can. And when I talk to people in a spiritual community, I speak their language. So I don't figure that anybody's quite in the same intersection that I am, and I try and reach out to them where they are.
Well, most of the listeners out there are pretty open-minded on Warrior Radio, so I'm going to love to hear sort of how synchronicity works. But before we get into that, just to set a foundation, like how would you define synchronicity?
Yeah, there are many aspects of it, and Carl Jung was among the first. I think he coined the word. It's my understanding, although I've never fully documented that. But generally, people ascribe him the creation of that word synchronicity, meaning synchro means alignment, and syn means align. Like what else could you use? SYN, that prefix means to come together. And chronos means time, at least a certain sense of time. So synchronos means things coming together in time. Generally, you can use the synonym meaningful coincidences. So a synchronicity, the way I talk about it, is a meaningful coincidence. I don't talk much about the connection between dreams and the things we experience, although some people would say if you have a dream about something and then it happens, that's a synchronicity. Or there's other ways you can look at synchronicity that other people have researched. And I focus on this one aspect, which is being in the right place at the right time. Or specifically, I really try and focus on when we work towards something specific in our lives, and then we begin to receive opportunities that align with that. And the reason I focus on that, it's not because the others aren't valid at all. It's just that I'm trying to sort of unravel at least one portion of the mystery. And once we get that, and we can describe that with physics, then maybe the other portions sort of fall into place.
Mm. And just to drive this sort of definition home, you said meaningful experience. So could you talk a little bit about that further? Because you use that specifically for reasons.
Yeah.
So what do you mean by meaningful experience?
It's a great question. It's perfect because that's actually the topic of the paper that I published this in 2016 that does the job of defining what meaning means in physics. Because every physicist you talk to, that I know at least, would say that meaning is something that's in our heads. It's psychological. So there is what I would call subjective meaning, which is psychologically based, and that is, you might say to me, you're walking down the street and someone walks up to you and says hello, and your response might be to cringe and sort of step back because the last time somebody walked up to you in the middle of the street and said hello, they stole your wallet. So you have a personal experience related to the experience you're having now that has some sort of subjective meaning to you, but it's actually unrelated to the situation because right now the person walking up to you to say hello might be someone who's a friend of a friend and recognized you and wants to come say hi and take you out to dinner or something. So a subjective meaning is something we layer on top of an experience that's in our heads. And that's what most people think of when they think about meaning, that's the only thing that there is in meaning. But what I think there is this other thing we need to call objective meaning. And objective meaning can be described in physics, and it's measured essentially. It's related to the entropy of something of a system, but that's a physics term. The meaning of a situation is related to how well you essentially distinguish between your possible futures. So by distinguish between your possible futures, what I mean is, let's say you want to get a new job, and you're at home, and you take the action of spending all night polishing your resume, looking up other resumes, formatting it properly, formatting it nicely, and then you spend the next day researching on Craigslist and on any source you can who might be offering jobs in your field. All of these actions you're taking are what I would say meaningful, and that's not subjective, right? You and I would all agree that what you're doing is taking action towards getting a job. That's meaningful action in an objective sense. And the way you define it objectively is to say that you're distinguishing between futures in which you do get a job and futures in which you don't get a job. And you're distinguishing really well between those because the actions you're taking are leading you towards those paths where you do get a job. By completing your resume and spending a lot of time on it and reaching out to people on Craigslist, you are actively taking steps that put you closer to getting some kind of job opportunity. And so you're distinguishing really, really clearly that that's the path you want, and I would call that a meaningful action on your part. Mm. And then a meaningful coincidence would be you submit resumes to 3 or 4 different places, and out of the blue, a friend calls you and says, hey, the company I'm working for needs someone to do XYZ, and that just sounds like a perfect idea for you, or maybe it's something you hadn't thought of, but it really works. And that is the meaningful coincidence that comes from all the meaningful actions that you took. And notice that the coincidence, which is unrelated, where your friend called you out of the blue, has the same meaning as the actions you were taking. It's about getting this job opportunity.
So, and you touched on this, just now, but how would you, in the most basic sense, explain how synchronicity works?
So In my view of synchronicity, like to restate that I think we can take meaningful action in our life. In fact, not that we can, but that we always are taking meaningful action in our life. Everything we do carries some kind of meaning to it. By sitting down and making the space, clearing out my little office here to have a quiet space so my daughter's not going to bother me, I've moved a little more towards the path of having a nice interview with you. And by spending time, with my daughter earlier today when she was home, I've moved a little more on the path towards her feeling settled and us having a strong relationship. And everything I choose to do moves me forward in some direction. And this is something that should empower us a lot, scare us maybe too, that everything we choose is moving us forward in some direction. And that can be positive or negative. It can be destructive or constructive. And it's not good or bad. That's the really important thing. This meaning idea is not about good or bad. If I spend my time dusting off my resume and polishing it, then I'm moving in that direction. If I spend time with my daughter, then I'm moving in that direction. I need to do both in my life in order to have a well-balanced life. But once I choose a direction to work on for an hour or a day or a week or whatever it is, I'm then creating momentum in that direction and building meaning in that direction. And my proposal is that from that, we're branching out onto a tree of possibilities. That from this point where we are right now, there's a tree of possibilities branching out in front of us. Every choice we make is a different branch on that tree. And the more I go down a certain branch by taking meaningful action in that direction, the more likely I am to find stuff on those branches out there that resonates with what I'm doing. You follow that?
Yeah, definitely. And based off of some of the resources that you have on your site, you use the word momentum. So after persistent action, sort of in a certain direction, you build up this momentum, and you find, a lot of these synchronistic experiences. So can you talk a little bit about just this idea of momentum and how it relates to synchronicity?
Yeah, momentum is a metaphor. In physics, it's a real thing where momentum is, once you get started in a car in a certain direction and then you try and stop, it takes you some time to stop because you have to hit the brakes and slow the car down. You don't just instantaneously stop. And that's because the car has mass and it's moving already, and so it has momentum. And to slow it down, you have to change its momentum, and that takes some time. And that's all explained by the laws of physics, Newton's laws. Well, it's a metaphor for how this works, and I think that, but it's the same idea, and so it's valid to use that word in a metaphorical sense, that every action we take is like adding a little bit of speed to those wheels in the car, if it's lined up in the same direction. So if I spend an hour dusting off my resume, I've given a little bit of speed to the car in that direction. But then if I go spend time with my daughter, I've given a little bit of speed in the car in a sort of a different direction. The problem comes when I start to then, instead of dusting off my resume or looking for jobs, I then decide I'm going to do the opposite of that, which might be I'm going to go back to school, let's say. So then I start looking into grad schools or undergraduate schools or whatever it is. And I no longer am working on adding momentum to the path of getting a job. I'm now adding momentum to the path of going back to school. And so then my momentum is being split in different directions. Like my energy is sort of slowing me down and from the getting a job path to speeding me up into the going to school path. If I keep going back and forth, you can see that I don't build up any momentum in any one direction, because every time I move in a different direction, it's changing where I was heading. The idea of how to use synchronicity more effectively is to recognize where we are spending our energy, where we're putting in energy to build a momentum. And first of all, deciding if that's the direction we want to go. Doing enough inner work or whatever, however it is, meditation that gets you to a place of knowing what's authentic for you. And once you know what that is, or you see where you're heading right now and you want to continue that, then you keep focusing in that direction and keep building the momentum. And my experience is that after we build up enough momentum, in other words, enough energy or enough actions that we take that are in a certain direction, we should expect meaningful guidance or meaningful experiences that help us along that path, just a little bit at a time. But the right person will come into our path at the right time just to get us to the next step.
Yeah.
And the more we do that, we can really start to feel that unfolding.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind is Joseph Campbell, and he always says, follow your bliss. And he says, when you do follow your bliss, doors that were closed, or that were once closed, will start to open in front of you. Mm-hmm. And that really resonates with everything that you've been saying.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that I think about a lot. A lot of folks think about synchronicity in a very non-scientific way, and they doubt it as a result. They think, well, synchronicity really exists. Why hasn't everyone just figured it out already, and why isn't life just full of wonderful things all the time? But synchronicity is not positive, it's neutral. And it's also not easy to see. So for the same reason you just said, that there's aspects like this where there's a quote by, what is his name? I'm forgetting, but he wrote, he quoted Goethe, and it's often attributed to Goethe. And he wrote about exploring in the Himalayas. And he says that from the moment that they committed to their path, when they bought their boat trip to Asia, at that point, and only at that point, did things begin to fall into place. And he says all manner of unforeseen incidents came across their path to help them along that path. And there's this element of commitment. We have to step off the cliff a little bit and take a risk. And there's something in that energy of doing that the physics or the universe, whatever you want to call it, fills in the gap and starts to bring things along to help us there. Mm. But I would say for me, a lot of my life, I haven't been willing to take that first step with confidence.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely scary stepping into the unknown, especially things like with your career and even with relationships and whatnot. So it's something that we all share.
It sure is, yeah.
But how can we use this model of synchronicity that you've been talking about to improve these aspects of our lives, such as career and relationships and health and whatnot?
Well, that's why I love this work, because not only am I doing what I find interesting by studying physics, but it has applications to the way I live my life every day. At the bottom level, just in my own mindset, we all share the quality of a lot of qualities, and one of those that I think we all share is not being in a rush to just to try new things or to stretch our comfort zones. And yet what I think the universe is asking us to do through this process of synchronicity is to stretch our comfort zones. And so I love speaking to people about this because it's hard for all of us. It's not like I'm just going up and talking about something that it's easy, or if you just follow my steps or something like that, then it'll all make sense. That would be dumb, just to be blunt. I'm interested in thinking about things in new ways and doing things that are difficult. And I'm glad that the universe is difficult. It makes it interesting and worthwhile. So I think that there's a few tips. I mean, one of the phrases that I wanted to mention that captures this idea of being able to take a risk and take a step is this. I like to say that fate follows free will. Mm. So we have free will to do things, and there is this thing that seems like fate. When we have a synchronicity and my friend appears at the movie theater at the same time as me and we had no plan, it seems like fate. But it wasn't predestined. It came as a result of the free will choice we made. What seemed like fate followed from free will. So it followed the free will. I made a free will choice to go to the movie theater. My friend then also ended up going to that same movie theater. And that all falls into place by a process that I call retroactive event determination, where events around us fall into place retroactively in order to match what we choose. So this idea that fate follows free will really implies that free will comes first. We are the deciders, as George Bush was quoted saying. And we have to take a step, and then the universe folds itself around that. And I think we tend to get caught up in trying to pay attention to the universe. So what is it that I need to do with my life? We're looking around us for the signs. What is it that I'm supposed to do with my life, or what is this I'm supposed to do with my weekend? The universe opens up when we decide what we're going to do, and then we start taking a step in that direction. And then we begin to get responses that seem like fate, like, oh, this person shows up at our house when we happen to be home because we decided to stay home and work on our house this weekend. And this person shows up at our house with things to, put in our windows or whatever it is that we're working on. Things fall into place around the choices we make.
Yeah.
And yet it's really important that we're not just choosing and blundering forward blindly. What I love about synchronicity is I think it teaches us to integrate the masculine and the feminine energies in each of us. The masculine part is about we are the ones that have free will. We decide what we're going to do and we take a step forward. But then the feminine energy or aspect is once we take a step forward, we then look around at what's the impact of that step. How did that affect the people around me? Yep. Did that move me closer to my goals? And most especially, did I receive some kind of feedback from the universe that I need to pay attention to? And then we can incorporate that, and then we take another step, and there's the masculine again.
Yeah. And, how can synchronicity help us on sort of more of a global scale, more of a, not just individually, but collectively? How can synchronicity, benefit, cities, countries, even the world?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I like to talk about this. One of the reasons that we struggle with something like climate change, for instance, is that it's really clear that nobody has a single solution, that there isn't a single solution. It's an integrated problem that's in part of everyone's life at all the time. The cause of climate change is rooted in our everyday lives. And we can't just change that by legislation, for instance. And we certainly, at least in this country, some of us are feeling really frustrated by the sort of the inability to have politics work in a way that makes any sense to us. It's very confusing and muddled. Well, synchronicity is a way of changing the power dynamic from something fighting against what's going on outside to seeing what is this struggle teaching me about myself and what's going on inside, and how can I get to where I'm trying to get to independent of the obstacles that are coming at me. So for instance, with climate change, there's a lot of folks that, I think this isn't really a sensible conversation because mostly people are trying to protect their own personal interests when they say this. But a lot of folks in business will say something like, we just can't solve the problem of using coal and gas for our energy needs. We just need too much energy. We're never going to get there with renewables. And I don't even know how to have that conversation because that's ignoring not only history and the way that we built up the industrial military complex and won World War II, or the way we built up this country to begin with, or any number of situations that you can point to in the history of the world where people have risen up and changed the world through ingenuity. We went to the moon. I mean, these things happen because people have a certain mindset where they believe that change or inventions can happen, and then they decide to step in that direction, even though they don't know how to get there. So I think synchronicity helps us by giving us the confidence that if we take a step in the direction of solving something like climate change, then these what seem to be intractable problems, like how do we build batteries that can actually not rip off the earth and can store the energy we need so that we can have solar be viable. Well, those inventions will happen, but we have to commit to that path. We can't just wait for the solutions to arise and then safely navigate over there. We have to be willing to step in the direction and commit to it, like we were talking about the guy's trip to the Himalayas, commit to that path. And I have no doubt in my mind that from that commitment, all manner of unforeseen assistance will arise to help us along that way.
Yeah.
And with climate change, this helps me not be panicked, because on one hand, I feel like there's always enough time. It's never too late, but there's always just barely enough time. So there's an urgency I feel every day when I wake up and when I go to bed that we have to do this as soon as possible today. It has to happen today. But of course, it never happens today, so then it's got to happen tomorrow. It's this tension of being willing to get up and do the work, knowing that it's urgent, and also realizing that it never goes as planned, and so we have to just be open to continuing to do the work.
Yeah, and knowing this, it really does empower the individual, because something like a climate change, it is very easy to feel, disempowered on an individual level. But when you think of, sort of the collective synchronicity, my choice, the choice that I make now actually affects synchronicity, of the whole. Something like that. Yeah. Sort of the choices that I make and the actions that I take are sort of moving everyone collectively towards sort of that. You're saying we're sort of branching off into the direction towards solving something like a climate change.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that can't be emphasized enough, that what the little actions we take when nobody's watching, when we're all alone and just deciding to work in a certain direction, those actions carry meaning, according to the theory that I'm proposing. They carry meaning with them, and they will bring you to whatever extent, proportional to the amount of effort you put in, they'll bring you opportunities that help you along that path. So if that path for you is, fixing your car, then that's the path where you will begin to experience those kind of meaningful coincidences that help you. But if you decide to direct your energy, at least part of your energy, towards issues that are beyond just your front door, and focus on politics, I spend a lot of time making phone calls on behalf of politicians or on behalf of issues like the 59 in California was a proposition to push back against Citizens United, because Citizens United basically allows corporations to have unlimited influence, anonymous influence in our political process, which is, in my view, just a horrible, unforgivable ruination of our democracy. And so we're fighting back against that. And Proposition 59 won, and it just sets us a little bit farther on the road towards getting rid of that, what I think is a horrible Supreme Court decision, and changing the influence of money on our political system at little steps and little bits of momentum along the way. And my decision to put some effort into that, I think, brought about synchronicity that helped us along the way.
Now, to switch things up a little bit, you also get into sort of the science of non-duality, and how sort of there is one consciousness, and we're all sort of expressions of the same consciousness, and it's sort of consciousness perceiving itself. I'm no different from you. My consciousness, at the most basic sense, is no different from yours, which is no different from my dog's. So if we could, let's get into that. How would you best explain sort of non-duality from the standpoint of science?
Yeah, that is a great question and a wonderful field. I attend a conference every year called the Science and Nonduality Conference. It's in San Jose, and I definitely recommend checking out their website, scienceandnonduality.com, I believe. And they're wonderful folks, and they do their best to bring science and spiritual disciplines together. And a lot of folks who are in just the science world and not in the spiritual discipline world don't recognize actually that spiritual traditions, many of them are scientifically, they use a scientific approach. Like Buddhism is not a religion because it doesn't talk about a god. It's a practice that encourages people to experiment with their state of mind. And by experimenting with your state of mind, you experience things that other people have experienced, the same type of state of mind, and you begin to see, oh, there's something objective happening here. If I do this, then this happens, and I experience this, and then we can talk about that. and we can share and have commonality. It's a scientific process. It just happens to be inside of our heads, and so it's hard to measure. Although we're getting to the point where we can use electrodes and stuff to measure alpha waves or whatever that is, and tell that there's something happening that's lined up. So the idea of the non-dual, the word non-dual really gets at pushing away the idea of religion or dogma and getting at a state where the mind and the matter are not separate anymore, or the consciousness and the world that the consciousness experiences are not separate anymore. That's the non-dual. The dual is to say that, well, there's mind and there's matter, and they're totally separate, and we can explain matter with physics, and mind we can't explain at all. We might think that's God, but we don't know what God is, so we just sort of we don't explain it. So that's the dual world. And non-dual is saying that there's no duality. It's all one, and we need to understand it all together. So synchronicity, is a word and a tool that I use to get to a bigger puzzle, and the bigger puzzle is, what is non-duality? What is consciousness? So I use synchronicity as a buzzword a lot. It's not because it's the only thing that I think matters at all. It's just something that allows us to pull on that one thread, and everything else starts to come.
Got it.
So one of the aspects of of synchronicity that I write about in my book, which will be coming out this year, is the relational aspect. And what I mean by relational in physics, that means that the state of the world is defined relative to each observer. So instead of thinking of the world out there as, it's all happening independent of me, and I'm just going along through my day kind of interacting with it, we have to begin to look at the world as happening and falling into place relative to us. And it's falling into place for other people relative to them. And then when, for you, it's falling into place relative to you in a certain way, and relative to me a certain way, not a different way, but a certain way. And when you and I meet and talk here, our worlds have to line up. So everything that we experience in common has to line up. But that doesn't mean that it's objectively happening out there in the world. The only thing that's actually real or physical, or these aren't quite the right words, but the only thing that you can know for certain is definitely happening in a determined way is what you observe right around you at any given moment. Everything else you're just making up. You're assuming that it's happening even though you're not observing it, but you don't know. And if you go to measure it, you will find that it happened, but that's a result of you measuring it or interacting with it. So back to non-duality, this is important because the world itself is only presenting itself to us individually, as individuals. It's unfolding relative to us.
Yep. Now, when I saw your talk on the Science of Non-Duality conference, and you sort of broke down sort of you defined it that there's one unified entity in existence, which is the self, which perceives the world itself through localized perspectives, individually, separately, one at a time. Now, you broke those two things down and sort of really got into the science of it, which I found was really interesting. So if we could, you could explain that to some of the listeners out there. So can you explain sort of those two areas of that statement?
Yeah. So this is a talk I gave where I had the opportunity to explore a little bit. And this is not stuff that I have rigorously shown, but it's a direction I would really like to. I think there's a lot of promise. And the idea was to show that starting from a principle that we would recognize as a spiritual foundation, like what's it called, the ephemeral principles or something like that. The foundation of most spiritual practices have to do with that there's some unifying consciousness or unifying entity. Some traditions call it God, others call it cosmic consciousness. For the fact of the matter is, physicists call it energy. I mean, maybe those are the same, maybe they're not. I don't know. But there's this idea that there's some unifying factor about this universe, And yet it appears to be diverse and have all sorts of different forms. And that's the contradiction that we face in the non-dual, in trying to understand non-duality. How come there's so much different things, and how come I am not the same person as my wife and we see things so much differently some of the time?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas at the same time, if we're both coming from one source, like, why aren't we the same? And so I got a chance to talk about this a little bit less formally in that talk. And the idea is that if you start from those two ideas, one, that everything is unified, and two, that everything is actually, in order for that unified consciousness to actually perceive anything or to have a definite experience, it has to take a definite form. And by taking a definite form, it loses the overall oneness and unity so that it can take a definite form. And then suddenly it's stuck in a body and it's looking out at the world, and now it's no longer aware of the oneness, it's aware of the manyness. And it's just one perspective among many. And this reminds me of a principle in physics called the complementarity principle, where, if you have a wave, you can look at a wave as a wave. Electron is a wave, and if you look at an electron in a different experiment, you'll find that it appears only in certain places at certain times, and you call it a particle. It's not that it's one or the other, that these are two different mutually exclusive possibilities of ways of looking at it. And it's the same thing with this, where or it's the same idea. I don't know if it's the same thing, but the same idea that if you look at, if you want to be in that oneness, if you want to go into a meditative state of Zen and Satori and immersion, dissolution in the cosmic consciousness, that's a place you can go, but you're not going to be able to then just transition into doing the dishes. Although the idea is to be able to sort of get to a place where you can stay in that Satori space while you're doing the dishes. But we can choose sort of one or the other, and simultaneous experience of both is, I wouldn't say it's not possible, but it's kind of like walking the knife's edge. That's where we're all trying to get to.
Right. And for a lot of the listeners out there, they've had those Satori experiences. They've had deep meditative practices where they've tasted it, or they've had psychedelic experiences that brought them there. But whatever the case is, they've experienced it. And one of the common descriptions when you sort of come back to, your everyday, your reality, what you usually sort of walking everyday consciousness, is that when you look back, you say that, space and time was kind of removed from that experience. And you actually sort of study something like non-duality by sort of removing space and time from a physics standpoint. And I think from one of your talks, you were talking about something, the Fourier transform. I tried to understand it when I was listening to the talk, but I couldn't really. But for those that don't know about that, can you help sort of explain this to people that don't know much about physics and science and whatnot?
Yeah, this is an area that I haven't completed yet, and it's an area that I think is very interesting. And the idea being that, well, I have completed some work around timelessness. That if you look at the laws of physics as developed in special relativity, you find that light, which we interact with all the time, right? Another word for light is a photon or a light particle. It's, light is made of little particles that fly around all over the place. And there's so many of them that you would blow your mind. Like even in this small office I'm sitting in right now, there's so many I could never possibly count. And all of these photons are moving at the speed of light, and nothing else in the world can move quite that fast because, well, at least nothing that has any mass can move quite that fast. So we're all limited by the speed of light. And so generally, why is that interesting? Well, because light itself, if you try to get up to light speed, time would slow down slower and slower and slower, the closer you got to light speed. Nothing can actually get to light speed, except light is at light speed. And so what I've analyzed is what is the implication of, or if you might say, what is the experience, although I don't use that word, but what is the experience that light has of being timeless? What would it be like to be a light particle and time would have stopped? What would that, and spaceless too, that space would have shrunken down to zero size. So the universe, from the perspective of a light particle, is infinitely small and not moving. Time is not moving at all. We can't picture that, so don't even try to picture that. But by carefully thinking about it, we can begin to understand that there's this, what I would call an information realm, a timeless realm that is essentially where light, what light is. And it's this timeless realm of possibilities. And I talked earlier about that tree of possibilities that we're all moving through. And, we make choices and we end up on this branch and we sort of head in that direction. And then we make another choice and we sort of head a different direction on some new branches off that branch. Well, that tree of possibilities exists in the information space. And that information space is timeless and spaceless. It's not like it's, sitting in a lockbox somewhere in the Institute of Measures, Bureau of Standards and Measures in France or something like that. It's not someplace in physical space. It's omnipresent. It's in an alternate, what we call a transformation of physical space. And so the Fourier transform is a transformation where you basically, mathematically, you add up all the pieces of space and time together in such a way that you get rid of them completely. And so space and time are completely gone from the picture, and what's left is a description of the world in terms of frequency and wavelength of waves.
Can you get a little bit into that on sort of the frequency and the waves and what is left once space and time is sort of removed from the equation?
Yeah, so the direction I'm trying to go with my research is, like, if you have, let's say you have a cup on your table.
Okay.
And that cup has a certain shape. And in anyone who's studied signal processing, which I'm not assuming your listeners have, but if you take any signal or any shape of any object, like a cup on your table, you can break it into a composition of frequencies of waves. It's what you do when you listen to an MP3 on your music player. Mm-hmm. Okay, the way you make an MP3 is you take a wave file, and a wave file is a vibration of sound of air molecules going up and down or back and forth, and you take that, you convert it into the Fourier realm or the information space. So it's now represented, instead of space and time, it's represented by frequency and wavelength, and you now have a bunch of frequencies instead of physically moving molecules or air molecules. And now that you have those frequencies, you can do things like take down the treble and take down the bass, and you can remove certain frequencies, or you can cut out little pops and hisses or whatever it is that you do as a sound engineer. And then you can, but before you listen to it, you can't just listen to that MP3 or to that transformation, because it's in Fourier space. You have to transform it back to physical space-time. And when you do that, what you do to make an MP3 is in Fourier space, you cut out all the frequencies you don't need, like the really high and the really low ones. And by the time you transform it back into physical space-time, you get the same sound, but it's much smaller because you just got rid of all the unnecessary frequencies. So your MP3 is now 5 megabytes instead of 60 megabytes. Mm. And so it's so cool how that all works. You transform yourself into this realm it doesn't have any space or time associated with it. You do your calculations on it, you remove the frequencies you don't need, and then you transform back, and you have something still in space-time, but it's been modified in an interesting way. So that's how Fourier transforms work.
Wow, that's super.
Now.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I was talking about the cup, so let's get back to the cup example.
Yep.
There's a cup on your table, and that cup is represented by some set of frequencies. That if you put together all those frequencies, you could reconstruct the shape of that cup, like at least on a computer, the shape itself. I don't know how you do that to create electrons and protons in the actual cup. Mm-hmm. We're not anywhere close to being able to do that. But you could recreate that shape. So the shape of my cup has a certain representation in the Fourier space or the information space. And if I move the cup, well, its Fourier representation doesn't change, at least in the main way. But it does change in one way, which is the phases of all those frequencies change. In other words, they sort of slide past each other in different amounts. But the frequencies themselves remain because the cup is made of a certain set of real fixed frequencies. And as you move all this cup around on your table, it's going to shift the way in which those frequencies are all relating to each other based on where you put it on the table. So there's this one-to-one relationship or mapping between the cup in physical space and the cup in information space. And in a long story, I think that relates to all the possibilities that can then unfold as the world evolves. And then we go about selecting some of those possibilities through the process of synchronicity.
Well, what was really interesting on one of your talks is you said that possibility was a fifth dimension. So can you talk a little bit about that and go into that further about possibility being that fifth dimension?
That's an interesting way to put it. Yeah, I think that is what I said, and I hadn't phrased it that way, but that's great. So if you start with a point, you probably learned this in elementary school, maybe you start with a point, and that's 0 dimensions. And then if you want to get to a one-dimensional object, you'll remember that a one-dimensional object is a line. It just extends out in one direction. And a point has no directions to it, so we call it 0 directions. But to get a line, like if you had a pencil and you want to make a line, you just make a bunch of dots side by side, and you can make a line that way. So a one-dimensional object is like a combination of 0-dimensional objects put side by side next to each other. And so now you have a line, and that's one dimension. Now, if I want to take that one dimension, let's say it's going from left to right, and I want to make it into a 2-dimensional object. Well, a 2-dimensional object is like a square or like a piece of paper. In order to get a piece of paper out of a line, if that line is sitting at the very bottom of the paper, I'd have to take a bunch of lines and stack them on top of each other in this new direction, and I would get a sheet of lines that would turn into like a sheet of paper. So that my one dimension gets extended out in this new direction to make 2 dimensions. So now what we're doing is we're taking multiple copies of our object and stacking them side by side in order to get the new dimension. So if we take a bunch of sheets of paper and stack them on top of each other, you know what we get? We get a ream of paper, which is thick. It's like a box. And so that's 3 dimensions because we've now stacked 2 dimensions on top of each other in this new direction to make the 3rd dimension. Now it gets a little more abstract. We have experience of time, and if you take a photograph or picture like an old film where you have an actual strip of film that plays in front of a projector, each of those images are a 3-dimensional snapshot. Well, it's actually 2-dimensional in the film, but picture it's representing an actual picture of you and I standing on a cliff looking out over the ocean or something like that and talking. But each of those clips is just a snapshot of that in time. It's not moving in time. And then the next one is a little bit different because we've changed our positions on that cliff overlooking the ocean. And then as we go on looking at each of those squares on the film, our positions on the conversation on that cliff are going to change. And that's essentially taking 3-dimensional representations of our world, putting them side by side on that film strip and turning them into the 4th dimension. The 4th dimension is time. Mm-hmm. And so by placing our experiences one after the other in a continuous way, we then get this new dimension of time. And so our lives are essentially a 4-dimensional reality where any single moment is 3 dimensions, and then it's evolving over time into the 4th dimension. So the 5th dimension then, if you use that same idea, it's essentially saying, okay, I'm going to take multiple copies of the 4th dimension, and I'm going to lay them side by side in some new direction so that they're parallel to each other. So remember the 4th dimension, I'm in a 4th dimension, a 4-dimensional reality where I'm talking to you and you and I are speaking in an interview about synchronicity, and that's this 4-dimensional reality. But if I want to look at what the 5th dimension is, it's some other version of that 4th dimensional reality that's different. And this gets into the many worlds hypothesis that was suggested in the mid 1900s, which essentially says that there's many different versions of ourselves existing in the world out there, and we're just experiencing one of those, and that's the four-dimensional reality we experience. But there's a fifth dimension of possibilities, all the different possibilities and four-dimensional possibilities that there could be. Now, I don't believe that it's necessary to talk about other versions of myself in the world out there or in some other alternate reality. I think that's an extravagant perspective that's unnecessary. But I think what it does tell us is that in the future, there are many possibilities. And those possibilities are all parallel, and they're mutually exclusive, right? If I go to bed at 9 o'clock, that's one possible future. And if I stay up and watch a show at 10 o'clock, that's another possible future. And I can't do both of those things. And those two are two different four-dimensional realities that coexist in this five-dimensional possibility space. By five-dimensional, I just mean taking the regular four-dimensional reality and then acknowledging that there's many different possible four-dimensional realities, and those must comprise this higher dimension that we call five.
Yeah, it's sort of a deeper explanation of what we were talking about with the branching and the decision trees that we were explaining earlier. Just
totally.
A more detailed description under the lens of physics.
Yeah, that tree is, I said it's not in some office at the Bureau of Standards or whatever, because it's a five-dimensional tree. It's a branching. Each one of those branches is a four-dimensional branch of reality we could experience.
Right.
But the tree itself is existing in the fifth dimension.
Yeah.
And then, I don't say that in a way to imply that. I think in physics we take the word dimension. It can mean different things, and people think it's really abstract. And I'm not trying to imply that we should try and measure the fifth dimension. It's not that kind of thing. Maybe that's the case, but just if you follow the logic of how we build up the previous dimensions from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, this is the natural extension of that logic.
Now, for those listening, is there any good intro books that you could recommend on things like sort of the synchronicity, the science of nonduality, the topics that we covered? Is there any sort of intro books that the layman could chew on?
Yeah, well, my book will be coming out sometime in this year, and it's going to be a good book. I definitely recommend checking it out. It's going to be fun. It's not aimed at physicists at all. It's aimed at folks. I want to have an impact on people in the way that we all live our life. I think what's so fascinating to me about physics is that about this aspect of physics, synchronicity, is that most physics doesn't really impact our daily life except through the technology we use, like our phones. But this physics actually applies to the choices we make in our life, the way that we run our lives. And that's what's so interesting to me. So I've written the book to be stories of my own personal stories and people that I've talked to and collected, the stories that are fresh and relevant, I think, to people. And then I also explain some of the science at a level that most people with curiosity can follow to a pretty good degree. So I try and really keep people engaged. And then I on my website as well, I have a lot of writing. So until that book comes out, you're welcome to go to skynelson.com and look at a lot of the different things I've written that are much shorter than that. But there are many books I've read over the years. The Dancing Wu Li Masters. Wu Li is spelled W-U-L-I. The Dancing Wu Li Masters. I think it's by Gary Zukov, and it's a fantastic book. It's sciencey enough, which is what I like about it, but it's not too sciencey. So but it's got enough in there to really feel like you're really learning something about the subject. And like I said, this other book called The Strange Story of the Quantum by Banesh Hoffman. I haven't read that book in probably 20 years, so I don't remember what level it's at, but it really influenced me. There's some other books. Brian Greene's book, is it The Elegant Universe? I think I read that when I was in high school. It's a good good book on this subject. I know that there's a lot of new stuff that I'm not giving credit to, and so much great material out there these days.
Is there any sort of sites or blogs or podcasts that you'd recommend that you sort of find yourself visiting regularly?
I will say that the Science of Nonduality.com, that organization posts a lot of. I would say that more of their stuff has to do with the non-dual aspect of it, and the world itself doesn't have enough science associated with this material, so it's a little harder to find that. But they do a great job trying to bring that together, and they have a lot of media, a lot of content that they put out there. So scienceandnonduality.com. When I look for information on synchronicity or on new talks on this topic, typically I want to see what I don't know, and so I'll just Google something out of the blue and see what pops up. I don't typically go back to the same sites. If I think, though, for a second, something will pop into my head. And on my website, I try and keep some links up there for people to find.
Yeah, but no worries.
Links.
If you come up with any other sites, let me know, and I can put it on the blog post for those that are keen to check out some of the other resources online that you enjoy. But Sky, thanks so much for sitting down with me. All right, that was Sky Nelson. I want to say a special thanks to him for sitting down with me. I hope you learned a lot about the science behind synchronicity. I think I'm going to be picking up my brains on the floor because it was just blown in this episode, especially when we were getting to a lot of the physics talk. And I hope you just enjoyed it. And if you do, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, Warrior Radio, and leave us a rating. Let us know what you think. Share it with your friends. It helps grow this project. It helps get things little unknown, little understood topics like synchronicity out into the public. So with all that said, I want to say thank you again for sitting down with me for this episode of Warrior Radio, and I will see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.